Sophie had always been a romantic. From childhood, she imagined herself meeting her soulmate in a way that felt destined, like something out of a fairy tale. She was the kind of person who believed in love at first sight, the magic of a first kiss, and the serendipity of the universe. For years, she had admired Josh from afar. He was everything she had ever wanted: kind, charming, and with a smile that made her heart race. But they were just friends, nothing more. One evening, as they sat together by the lake, watching the sunset, Josh brought up something unexpected. "You know about the local love ritual, right?" he asked with a grin. Sophie nodded, having heard about it from her grandmother. It was a tradition in their small town, a ritual that was supposed to bind two people together forever. "What if we did it?" Josh suggested, his eyes twinkling mischievously. Sophie's heart leapt at the thought. Could this be the moment she had been waiting for all her life? The ritual was simple, or so it seemed. According to local legend, it required two people to venture into the nearby forest under the light of a full moon. They would exchange vows at an ancient stone hidden deep in the woods and leave behind a token of their love. Sophie had always been drawn to the mystery of it, but now that Josh suggested they try it, it felt like fate was aligning in her favor. That night, Sophie stood in front of her bedroom mirror, her excitement palpable. She felt like she was on the verge of something life-changing. As she put on her jacket, her phone buzzed. It was Josh, telling her he was outside. She smiled, her heart fluttering. Together they would perform the ritual, and maybe, just maybe, their love would blossom. But as Sophie stepped out into the cool night air, she had no idea that they were about to awaken something much darker than they could have imagined. The forest felt different that night. The trees seemed to lean closer, their branches intertwining overhead, casting eerie shadows in the moonlight. Sophie walked beside Josh, her hand brushing against his occasionally, sending sparks through her veins. She had been in these woods many times before, but tonight it felt like an entirely different place. The air was thick with tension, and every sound seemed amplified. The crunch of leaves beneath their feet, the rustling of the wind through the trees, the distant hoot of an owl. Josh led the way with confidence, but Sophie couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them. "Are you sure about this?" she asked, her voice quieter than she intended. Josh grinned and shrugged. "It's just a silly ritual, nothing to worry about." But as they ventured deeper into the woods, that sense of unease grew stronger, settling into Sophie's bones. She tried to ignore it, focusing instead on Josh and the idea of their love being bound forever. After what felt like hours of walking, they finally reached the stone. It was larger than Sophie had imagined, its surface rough and covered in strange markings that looked ancient. The moonlight illuminated it, casting an almost ghostly glow over the clearing. Sophie shivered, suddenly aware of the cold seeping into her skin. "This is it," Josh said softly, his voice cutting through the quiet night. He pulled a small notebook from his pocket, one that he had written their vows in earlier that day. Sophie had laughed when he showed it to her, thinking it was sweet that he had taken it so seriously. Now, standing in front of the stone, it didn't seem so funny anymore. As Josh began to read his vows, the wind picked up, swirling around them. His voice carried through the night, echoing off the trees, but Sophie could barely hear him. All she could focus on was the stone, There was something wrong about it, something ancient and powerful. And as she placed her hand on its cold surface, she felt a jolt of energy surge through her. Sophie's turn came to speak her vows, but as she opened her mouth, a strange sensation took hold of her. Her words felt stuck in her throat, as if something was holding them back. She glanced at Josh, who was watching her expectantly, but all she could think about was the stone and the energy that had surged through her when she touched it. Taking a deep breath, she forced herself to focus, pushing away the strange feeling and reciting the words she had prepared. When they were finished, they each left behind a token. Josh left a bracelet his grandmother had given him, and Sophie placed a small locket she had worn since she was a child. As they walked away from the stone, hand in hand, Sophie couldn't shake the feeling that they had just done something much more serious than a simple love ritual. Something had changed, though she couldn't yet tell what. The first sign that something was wrong came the next morning. Sophie woke up feeling unusually drained, as if she hadn't slept at all. Her dreams had been filled with strange images, dark shadows, twisted trees, and a figure watching her from the distance. She tried to shake it off, blaming it on nerves and excitement from the night before, but as the day wore on, the unease only grew. When she saw Josh later that day, she expected him to say something about how weird the ritual had been, but he seemed completely normal, smiling and joking as usual. "That was fun, right?" he said, wrapping his arm around her shoulders. Sophie forced a smile, not wanting to sound paranoid. But as they walked through town together, she noticed something odd. People were staring at them, their expressions unreadable. Sophie had never felt so uneasy, and deep down, she knew something was very wrong. That night, Sophie's dreams were worse. She woke up in a cold sweat, her heart racing, the images from her nightmares lingering in her mind. There was a figure, a shadowy presence that seemed to be getting closer every time she closed her eyes. She tried to tell herself it was just her imagination, but the fear that gripped her was all too real. Desperate for some sense of normalcy, she called Josh. He answered quickly, his voice calm and reassuring, but something about him seemed distant, almost distracted. When she told him about her dreams, he brushed them off, saying they were just a result of the ritual playing tricks on her mind. "You're overthinking it," he said, his voice soothing but detached. But Sophie wasn't so sure anymore. Something had been awakened, and she feared that it was far more than just a silly love spell. As the days passed, the strange occurrences became more frequent. It started small. Things in Sophie's room would go missing or move on their own. Doors would creak open when no one was near, and the house would feel unusually cold, even when the sun was shining. Sophie tried to ignore it at first, blaming it on her imagination, but it was becoming harder to explain away. One afternoon, while she was getting ready to meet Josh, she caught a glimpse of something in the mirror. For a split second, there was a shadow standing behind her, tall and dark, with no distinct features. Sophie spun around, her heart pounding, but there was nothing there. She stared at her reflection, trying to calm herself, but the unsettling feeling lingered. She couldn't help but wonder if this had something to do with the ritual. Deep down, she knew that whatever they had awakened was growing stronger. Josh began to change too. At first, it was subtle. He seemed more distant, more distracted whenever they were together. His usual warmth and playfulness were replaced by an unsettling coldness. When Sophie asked him if something was wrong, he would smile and brush it off, but his eyes told a different story. They were darker somehow, as though something was clouding his thoughts. Sophie couldn't ignore it anymore. She pressed him about the ritual, asking if he had noticed anything strange since that night. Josh hesitated before answering, his smile fading. "I've been having weird dreams too," he admitted, though he tried to make it sound like it wasn't a big deal. "But it's nothing really. We're just overthinking it." Sophie wanted to believe him, but the sense of dread that hung over her was impossible to shake. Desperate for answers, Sophie sought out her grandmother, who had always been the keeper of the town's old legends and traditions. She found her sitting on the porch, knitting, as if nothing in the world could disturb her peace. Sophie hesitated, unsure how to begin, but finally blurted out, "Grandma, what do you know about the love ritual?" Her grandmother's hands stilled, her eyes narrowing. "Why do you ask?" she said, her voice unusually sharp. Sophie explained what had happened, leaving out the worst of her fears. But as she spoke, her grandmother's expression grew grim. "That ritual is not a game, Sophie," she warned. "It was never meant for what people think it is. The old stories say that those who perform it without understanding awaken something dangerous, something that feeds on love, but not in the way you expect." Sophie's stomach twisted with fear. "What do you mean?" she asked. But her grandmother wouldn't say more, only shaking her head as if Sophie had opened a door that should have stayed shut. That night, Sophie's dreams became more intense. The shadowy figure that had haunted her before was now closer, more defined. It had eyes, red and glowing, watching her every move. The trees in the forest were twisted and warped, as though the very land itself had been corrupted. And Josh was there, standing by the stone, but he wasn't the Josh she knew. His eyes glowed with the same eerie light, and his smile was cold, almost cruel. She woke up screaming, her heart racing and her body drenched in sweat. This was no ordinary nightmare. This was a warning, a glimpse into something far darker than she had ever imagined. Sophie knew she couldn't ignore it any longer. Whatever they had awakened wasn't just following her, it was consuming them both. The next day, Sophie confronted Josh, determined to find out what was really going on. She met him at the lake where they had first talked about the ritual, but something about him seemed off. He was quiet, distant, his eyes darting around as if he was looking for something unseen. "Josh, we need to talk," Sophie said, trying to keep her voice steady. "This isn't just in our heads. Something is happening to us. Ever since the ritual, things have been wrong." Josh looked at her, his expression blank for a moment, and then he sighed. "I know," he admitted softly. "I've been feeling it too. But what are we supposed to do? It's not like we can undo it." Sophie's heart sank. She had hoped he would have some sort of plan, some way to fix what they had done. But hearing the fear in his voice only confirmed her worst suspicions. Whatever they had awakened, it wasn't going to go away easily. And now it was up to them to figure out how to stop it. The presence became impossible to ignore. At first, it only seemed to be in Sophie's dreams, but soon it began appearing during the day. The shadow was everywhere, in the corners of her room, at the edge of her vision, and always just out of reach. It was watching, waiting. Sometimes she could feel it breathing down her neck, though when she turned around, nothing was there. Josh seemed to be faring no better. He admitted to Sophie that he too was seeing the shadow, feeling its presence. But unlike Sophie, he seemed resigned to it, as if he had already accepted that there was nothing they could do. "It's too late," he said one evening, his voice hollow. "Whatever we brought back, it's not going to let us go." Sophie refused to believe that. She couldn't. There had to be a way to stop this. But as the days passed, the shadow grew stronger, and the line between the waking world and her nightmares blurred. Time was running out. Sophie spent hours in the town library, poring over old books and folklore, desperate to find some mention of the ritual they had performed. Most of the stories she found were vague, full of half-truths and superstitions. But there was one recurring theme. Anyone who performed the ritual incorrectly risked unleashing something dark, something that could not easily be controlled. One passage in particular stood out. Love is the most powerful force, but it can also be the most dangerous. When twisted, it becomes a weapon. Those who seek to bind themselves through ancient means must be prepared to face what lies on the other side of desire. Sophie's heart pounded as she read the words. It made sense now. They had unknowingly awakened something that fed on their desire, something that was now feeding on them. But there was still no mention of how to stop it. Sophie knew one thing for certain. Whatever they had awakened would only grow stronger unless they found a way to break the bond. The connection between Sophie and Josh grew more intense, but not in the way she had hoped. Every day she felt more drawn to him, but it wasn't the natural pull of love. It was something darker, more insidious. Their emotions were no longer their own. They were being manipulated, twisted by the force they had awakened. Sophie could feel it inside her, like a shadow coiling around her heart, squeezing tighter with each passing day. She could see the same thing happening to Josh. He was becoming more withdrawn, his once bright eyes now dull and clouded. "We need to find a way to end this," Sophie whispered to herself one night, staring at the moon through her window. But how? The shadow was growing stronger, and with every passing moment, it seemed to tighten its grip on both of them. Sophie couldn't fight this alone anymore. The weight of what they had unleashed was too great, and with Josh slipping further away from her, she knew they needed outside help. She remembered an old woman in the town, someone people whispered about but rarely spoke to. Mrs. Hawthorne was rumored to know things, ancient things, mystical things, and Sophie hoped that maybe she could offer a solution. The next morning, Sophie gathered her courage and made her way to Mrs. Hawthorne's small cottage on the edge of the forest. The house was old, with ivy creeping up its walls and windows clouded with dust. Sophie hesitated before knocking, her heart pounding. A moment later, the door creaked open, revealing the old woman. Mrs. Hawthorne's eyes, sharp and knowing, seemed to peer right through Sophie. "I've been expecting you," she said, in a voice that sent chills down Sophie's spine. Inside the cottage, the air was thick with the smell of herbs and burning candles. Mrs. Hawthorne motioned for Sophie to sit, her gnarled hands moving gracefully despite her age. "You've done something you shouldn't have," the old woman said, not unkindly, but with a firmness that left no room for argument. Sophie explained the ritual, how she and Josh had performed it, thinking it was just a harmless tradition. Mrs. Hawthorne listened in silence, her face unreadable. When Sophie finished, the old woman sighed deeply. The ritual you performed is not about love. It is about power. Love, when twisted, becomes dangerous. What you awakened is a spirit bound to the stone, a spirit that feeds on the love and lives of those who invoke it. It grows stronger as your bond deepens. Sophie's heart raced. How do we stop it? She asked, desperate for an answer. Mrs. Hawthorne's eyes darkened. The bond must be severed, but it won't be easy. The spirit will not let go without a fight. Mrs. Hawthorne laid out the grim truth. The bond between Sophie and Josh was more than emotional now. It was spiritual. The force they had awakened wasn't just feeding on their connection. It was amplifying their desire, twisting it into something dangerous. The only way to break the bond was through a counter-ritual, one that required a sacrifice, something meaningful, something that would sever their tie to the spirit. You must give up what bound you in the first place, Mrs. Hawthorne said gravely. The love you sought to deepen will be the thing you must surrender. If you're not careful, the spirit will take more than just your emotions. It will take your very souls. Sophie's stomach twisted in fear. Could she really give up her feelings for Josh? She had dreamed for so long of being with him, of finding her soulmate, but now that dream was turning into a nightmare. As much as it hurt, Sophie knew she couldn't let this darkness consume them both. Armed with Mrs. Hawthorne's grim warning, Sophie knew she had to talk to Josh. She found him in the park, sitting alone on a bench, staring blankly into the distance. His once vibrant energy seemed to have drained away, leaving him a shadow of the person she had once known. As she approached, Sophie's heart ached. How had things gotten this bad so quickly? Josh, she called softly. He turned to look at her, his eyes hollow. Sophie sat down beside him, her hands trembling as she explained what Mrs. Hawthorne had told her. At first, Josh was silent, listening but not really reacting. When she finished, he finally spoke, his voice low and strained. So, you're saying we have to give up us? Sophie nodded, her throat tight with emotion. It's the only way to stop this. If we don't, it's going to take everything from us. Josh recoiled at the idea of giving up their love. No, there has to be another way, he insisted, his voice rising in desperation. We can't just give up on everything we've wanted. There has to be a way to fix this without losing each other. Sophie wanted to believe him. She wanted to cling to the hope that they could find a way to undo the damage without sacrificing their bond. But deep down, she knew the truth. The spirit was feeding on their connection, growing stronger with each passing day. The longer they waited, the more dangerous it would become. I don't want to lose you either, Sophie whispered, tears welling in her eyes. But if we don't stop this now, we'll lose more than just each other. We'll lose ourselves. Josh fell silent, his face pale and drawn. He didn't want to admit it, but Sophie could see the fear in his eyes. They were running out of time. As the days passed, the darkness inside both of them grew. Sophie felt it creeping into her thoughts, warping her emotions. Her love for Josh, once pure and hopeful, now felt tainted by something sinister. She would catch herself staring at him, feeling possessive, almost jealous in a way that wasn't her. It was as if the spirit was using her own feelings against her, making her weaker by the day. Josh, too, seemed to be struggling. He became more withdrawn, more erratic in his behavior. Sometimes he would lash out for no reason. Other times, he would seem lost in a trance, his mind somewhere else entirely. Sophie feared that the spirit was gaining control over them little by little. One night, while lying in bed, Sophie felt the weight of the presence more than ever before. It was watching her, whispering things in her ear that she couldn't quite understand but felt in her bones. It wanted something only she and Josh could give. And it wasn't going to stop until it got what it wanted. Determined to end this nightmare, Sophie returned to Mrs. Hawthorne's cottage. The old woman handed her a small, worn book filled with ancient symbols and instructions for the counter ritual. It was dangerous, Mrs. Hawthorne warned, and they would have to perform it precisely at midnight under the next full moon. "You must be strong," Mrs. Hawthorne said, her voice firm. "The spirit will resist. It will try to deceive you, to turn you against each other. But you must stay united. Only your willpower will keep it from taking over." Sophie nodded, trying to suppress her fear. She had never felt more terrified, but she knew they couldn't back out now. The ritual required both her and Josh to be fully committed, and they would need to act quickly before the spirit grew too powerful to defeat. Sophie could feel the tension building between her and Josh as the night of the counter ritual approached. The bond that had once connected them was now a source of pain and fear. They spoke less, the air between them thick with unspoken words and lingering doubts. Josh seemed more resistant to the idea of the ritual as the days passed, his mind clouded by something Sophie couldn't quite reach. One evening, as they sat together in silence, Josh finally spoke. "Are you sure this is what we have to do?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "What if we're making it worse? What if we're giving the spirit exactly what it wants?" Sophie looked at him, her heart heavy with uncertainty. She didn't have all the answers, but she knew one thing for sure. If they didn't try, they would lose everything. "We don't have a choice," she said softly, her voice trembling. "We have to fight this." The night before the ritual, the spirit made its move. Sophie woke in the middle of the night to the sound of whispering, low, insistent voices that seemed to be coming from the walls of her room. As she sat up in bed, her skin prickling with fear, she saw the shadow again. But this time, it wasn't just lurking in the corners of her room. It was standing at the foot of her bed, its red eyes glowing in the darkness. Sophie's breath caught in her throat as the shadow moved closer, its form shifting and swirling like smoke. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. The spirit reached out toward her, its cold, ethereal fingers brushing against her skin. A wave of fear crashed over her, paralyzing her in place. Just as the shadow seemed ready to envelop her completely, it suddenly recoiled, retreating into the darkness. Sophie gasped for breath, her body trembling. The spirit wasn't going to wait for them to end it. It was coming for them now. The night of the full moon had arrived. Sophie and Josh stood together in the clearing where they had performed the love ritual weeks ago. The stone, now covered in dark moss, seemed to pulse with an eerie energy. The atmosphere was thick with tension, the air cold and heavy. Sophie clutched the small book Mrs. Hawthorne had given her, its pages worn and fragile. She could feel the presence of the spirit all around them, lurking, waiting. Josh was quiet, his face pale in the moonlight. Sophie could sense his hesitation, his fear. They were about to confront something far more powerful than either of them had anticipated. "Are you ready?" Sophie asked, her voice barely a whisper. Josh met her gaze, his eyes filled with uncertainty. "I don't know if we can do this," he admitted. "What if we fail?" Sophie swallowed hard, her heart pounding in her chest. "We won't," she said, more to herself than to him. "We have to try." They began the ritual, following the ancient words written in the book. Sophie spoke the incantations aloud, her voice trembling as the wind began to howl around them. Josh lit the candles they had brought, their flames flickering wildly in the sudden gusts of wind. The ground beneath them seemed to shift, as though the earth itself was responding to the power they were calling upon. As Sophie recited the final words of the incantation, the ground trembled violently. A chilling cold swept through the clearing, and the shadow that had been haunting them began to materialize. It was no longer just a faint figure lurking in the dark. It was fully formed now, towering over them, its red eyes glowing with malice. The spirit spoke, its voice a low, guttural growl that reverberated through the air. "You dare to defy me?" it hissed, its form swirling like smoke. "Your love is mine. You cannot escape." Sophie's heart raced, but she stood her ground. "We won't let you take us," she shouted, her voice shaking. "We're ending this." Josh, too, stepped forward, his fear momentarily forgotten. "We're not afraid of you anymore," he said, his voice stronger than before. "You don't control us." The spirit laughed, a dark, menacing sound that sent chills down their spines. "You have no idea what you've unleashed," it sneered. "But if you wish to sever the bond, you must pay the price." Sophie's stomach twisted as the spirit's words echoed in her mind. The price. Mrs. Hawthorne had warned them that the ritual would require a sacrifice, but Sophie hadn't fully understood what that meant. Until now. The spirit was feeding on their love, and to sever the bond, they would have to let go of the very thing that had drawn them together in the first place. Josh turned to Sophie, his eyes filled with sorrow. "We have to do it, don't we?" he asked quietly. "We have to give up. Us." Sophie's heart ached at the thought. She had dreamed of being with Josh for so long, of finding her soulmate, but now that dream had become a nightmare. If they didn't let go, the spirit would continue to consume them until there was nothing left. With tears in her eyes, Sophie nodded. "Yes," she whispered, "we have to." Together they spoke the final words of the ritual, releasing the love they had once shared. As they did, the spirit let out a terrible scream, its form writhing and contorting as it was forced to retreat. The ground shook violently, and for a moment, it seemed as though the entire world was tearing apart. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the storm subsided. The air grew still, and the shadowy figure dissolved into nothingness, its hold on them broken at last. The clearing was silent now, the oppressive weight of the spirit's presence gone. Sophie and Josh stood together, their hands still clasped, but something had changed between them. The bond that had once connected them so deeply was severed, and though they still cared for each other, the intense pull they had felt was gone. Sophie looked up at Josh, her heart heavy with the bittersweet realization that they were free, but at a cost. "It's over," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Josh nodded, his expression unreadable. "Yeah, he said softly. It's over. They stood in silence for a long time, neither knowing what to say. The love that had once burned so brightly between them had been the very thing that had nearly destroyed them, and now, in its absence, there was only a quiet emptiness. In the weeks that followed, Sophie and Josh drifted apart. They still saw each other from time to time, exchanging polite smiles and small talk, but the connection they had once shared was gone. Sophie felt a strange sense of relief, mixed with an undeniable sadness. She had lost something important, but she had also gained something even more valuable: her freedom. The nightmare stopped, the strange occurrences ceased, and life slowly returned to normal. Sophie still thought about the spirit sometimes, wondering if it had truly been vanquished or if it was merely lying dormant, waiting for another chance to strike. But for now, she was content to let the past stay in the past. One day, as she walked through the park where she and Josh had once spent so much time, Sophie paused to look out over the lake. The water was calm, the surface shimmering in the sunlight. She took a deep breath, feeling the weight of everything that had happened begin to lift. She had survived. They both had. Sophie knew that life would never be the same after everything she had been through, but she also knew that she was stronger for it. The ritual had tested her in ways she could never have imagined, but it had also shown her the strength that lay within her. As she moved forward, Sophie allowed herself to hope again, not for the perfect love she had once dreamed of, but for something real, something true. The bond she had shared with Josh had been intense, but it had also been dangerous, fueled by forces they didn't understand. Now, she was free to find love on her own terms, without the weight of the past hanging over her. And as Sophie walked away from the park, she couldn't help but smile. For the first time in a long time, the future felt bright. The darkness was behind her, and she was ready to embrace whatever came next. The ending of the story reveals that Sophie and Josh must sacrifice their love to stop the evil spirit they accidentally awakened through the love ritual. After consulting with Mrs. Hawthorne, Sophie learns that the bond they created has empowered the spirit, and the only way to sever it is to give up their deep emotional connection. During the final ritual, Sophie and Josh make the difficult decision to let go of their love. As they complete the counter ritual, the spirit which had been feeding on their bond is destroyed, and the hold it had over them is broken. The experience, however, creates a rift between them, and they gradually drift apart, no longer bound by the intense feelings they once shared. In the end, Sophie reflects on the events, acknowledging the loss of their love, but also recognizing her newfound freedom and strength. She moves forward with her life, wiser and stronger from the ordeal, ready to face the future with hope, even though her relationship with Josh has come to an end. The story closes with Sophie looking toward a brighter future, leaving the darkness behind. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button to stay updated on more thrilling content. Let me know in the comments what you thought of Sophie and Josh's journey, and if you'd like to see more true stories like this. Make sure to turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. See you in the next video. Stay curious, stay adventurous.